This whole CSS and JavaScript thing is complicated. If we just look up a little about that, CSS and JavaScript, see what we get. We get a couple of unhelpful pieces of documentation related to something else, but CSS and JavaScript, this calls it the future of component-based styling. Here's all you need to know about CSS and JS. This one says stop using CSS and JavaScript for web development. I don't agree with this person. I think it's fine to do. I think there are times you don't want to, but I think there's some real advantages. Let's look at all we need to know. All we need to know. Well, if we look at this post, there's a lot here. You probably heard terms like CSS and JS, styled components, Radium, Aphrodite. Right? Okay. Well, it turns out there's lots of ways of doing this, including several libraries for doing so. Styled components is a library, Radium is a library, Aphrodite is a library. And this is a pretty good discussion, and it's linked on the website. Here's a point. Inline styles in CSS and JavaScript are not the same. These are really inline styles we've been doing, but we have been doing them in JavaScript. But what these other libraries do is when they're finished, instead of ending up with just the style property on the elements set, they actually create a style sheet. They actually add a style tag in the head and put CSS rules there. What that means is that we can use things like pseudo classes like hover and media queries for responsive design and stuff like that. You can do anything that you can do in CSS. Keyframe animations, whatever. So maybe we use one of those. I think it's an interesting topic. We won't go too deep, but let's try using one of those real quick just to see what it gets us. Let's use Aphrodite. I looked into that. It looks pretty nice. Not too hard to use. So let's look at it. Works great with and without React. Supports media queries. Supports pseudo selectors like hover. Yay. All stuff that we're interested in. So to install, it says npm install -- save Aphrodite. These days, you don't need -- save if you're using a current version of npm. And we're not using npm at all. We are using yarn. So in that case, we type yarn add Aphrodite. Yarn add Aphrodite does two things. Here's a quick link in Slack. Yarn add does two things. First, it downloads it and puts it in node modules. But it also adds it to the dependencies list in package.json, which is important. There it is. Because while yarn add adds it to our node modules folder, remember we're not committing the node modules folder. So if we put that in GitHub and someone else clones our repository and types yarn install, they would not get that unless it were in package.json. So yarn add does both things. It adds it to your dependencies list, and it actually puts it in your project. How do we use it? Here's an example. We need to import style sheet and CSS from Aphrodite. Go ahead and do that. Well, there's something I've forgotten, but I'll go ahead and keep forgetting it so that you see what happens if you forget. So I'll import it up here, right under React, because it's coming from a node module. Did it blow up yet? Didn't blow up yet. And maybe it won't. But oftentimes after you install a new node module, you have to kill and restart your server. It doesn't necessarily reload them. So kill my server, run yarn start again. If you don't ever run into trouble, maybe you don't need to do it, but a lot of times you'll have to do that. Okay, so now we have style sheet and CSS, whatever those are. So when we create our styles object down here, it looks basically the same, except now we say stylesheet.create, and we pass this object in as an argument. So down we go to our styles object here, and I will just say stylesheet camel cased parentheses. Don't forget my close parenthesis at the end. All right, that wasn't too hard. And then the way Aphrodite works, again, instead of actually adding those styles directly to the elements, it actually writes CSS up in the head of the document and assigns them to the elements using classes. So even though we're not using classes here, what it does is it takes each one of these rules and auto-generates a class for it, giving it some unique name. And then it automatically puts the correct class on the correct elements. We just have to tell it which elements those are. So this CSS function that we imported from Aphrodite takes one of our styles as an argument, creates a CSS class for that, and then returns the name of that class as a string. So we can take the return value of CSS and assign it to class name. So we'd no longer say style equals styles.sidebar. Now we say class name equals CSS parentheses styles.sidebar. Because CSS parens, this function call will actually return the class that it auto-generates as a string, and we can just assign that to class name. Now here it's complaining because I've assigned 2 class names. Well, I don't need the class name sidebar anymore because I'm not using an external style sheet. And we're not using any DOM methods like query selector. So I don't need that on there anymore. So I will just put class name equals CSS styles sidebar. So for all of these where I have style now, I'll change them to class name equals, and then I'll wrap this in a call to CSS. And I'll get rid of any other class names that are there until I get to font awesome. So we'll deal with that in a second. So class name, wrap this, CSS. Don't need this style. Instead, I need class name. Wrap this in CSS. Get rid of the old class name. Same. And this is going to screw up our opacity thing, but that's okay. We'll just screw it up for now. We're not going to use the mouse enter, mouse leave trick anymore. So get rid of this class name. Change this to class name. I don't know what the heck to do about the dang font awesome thing. I do know what to do, but I'm pretending not to so we can demonstrate it. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of state and handle mouse enter, handle mouse leave. We're not doing that anymore. So heck, we don't need state anymore. I could change it back to a stateless functional component. And I'm going to. Const sidebar equals arrow function. Don't need a render method, just need to return. Get rid of that. And it's a stateless functional component again, just like that. Go ahead and fix my indentation. So what to do about the font awesome thing? Because I actually need, yeah, we can stop importing component too. Notice the squiggle there reminded me. Component is defined but never used. I actually need these class names, FA and FA sign out, but I also need these styles. What's a boy to do? So the class name is a string, right? And calling CSS styles button icon is going to return a class name. So what if I did this? What if I set class name equal to a template literal using backticks, And I use interpolation here to stick the return value of CSS, my keyboard CSS, parentheses, like this. And then I just stick FA and FA sign out in there too. So backtick FA, space, FA sign out, space, and then the return value of this. That should give me all three classes. Yeah, it's probably better on multiple lines. Okay, got a slight problem here. Object is not a function. Const styles equals style sheet. Go ahead. Style sheet.create, indeed. Object is not a function. Create is. Style sheet.create. There we go. Now it's back to looking without the mouse enter. I forgot to take on mouse enter and on mouse out off of the link here. So now it's working except for that. But the whole point of switching to Aphrodite is because we said that we can actually use things like hover now. So here's how we can do that. Here's the image we want to do it to. So we have a styles.newNote item or newNote image already. So I will just add newNote image hover. And then as a key, I just put the string :hover, the pseudo class. Give it a value with my rule. Opacity 0. So just use :hover as a key. Put my rule in there. Here's the name. Go back to the element in question, which is this one. This CSS function can take multiple arguments, and it will create the appropriate classes and return them both. So we don't have to do any goofy spread operator stuff. So I can just say, comma, newNote image hover, or styles dot newNote image hover, and it'll apply both. And there we go. So another way we could do it. If it seems like it's a lot more work than just doing it the other way, that's only because you got to copy and paste my style sheet. Yes, copying and pasting pre-written style sheets is easier than writing them from scratch. But writing them from scratch using this versus writing them from scratch in CSS, not really any significant difference. There's actually auto-completion in here. If I start trying to put some like align items, so it'll still let me do that. So there's no syntax highlighting for this in this context. I bet there's probably a package I could find to do that. But basically, it's not much harder to do this than it would be the other way. Questions? So style, sidebar, using Aphrodite.